If you've been listening to my Zigzag for Zero over the last several months, you've heard me refer a few times to the desire that I have to speak with individuals who are at the formation of Gestalt, which is one of the methodologies and practices that I am steeped in because of my late husband, Yogi Raj Charles Bates. And it's been foremost on my mind this year to just do a little check-in with people who are far more knowledgeable. I would call them masters in that area. And today I get to introduce you to two people who are not only very, very, very dear in my heart, we're very dear friends of Yogi Raj Charles Bates, but also are masters in Gestalt and specifically in organizational and development systems. So here we go. I want to introduce you to John and Veronica Carter. And I want to thank you for taking time. We had a wonderful afternoon to just catch up and spend time together. And you were kind enough to extend the date a little bit more so that we could also talk about some of the things that have been on my mind. But first, I told you that I'm doing this little montage to introduce Yogi Raj to the world through more than just his loving wife's lens. Would each of you just give me and give us a little memory of Yogi Raj?
Okay, I'll begin. Actually, I met Yogi Raj Charles Bates, as you call him, Charles to me all those years, who would come and stay at our place when he and John were working together on different projects, and then we were on the same faculty together for a while. And so I just knew him as very artful, very present human being, a captivating lecturer, a reliable, trustworthy colleague when we were on the OST faculty together. And then just as a friend, because he spent so many days and hours in our house when he would come to town. But there was one story that was very significant to me, but it may not, for people who maybe are not meditators, they may not grasp how significant. But I had this one experience that was stuck with me for my whole life, that I had in meditation while using mantra. And I explained it to him, and he readily helped me to understand what that was for me, what it was in general, and put it in the frame of reference that I just deeply appreciated. And I deeply appreciated, that was the first time I started to grasp the depth of what he was doing, because I always knew him as a Gestalt colleague, and the depth of what he was doing with what he had done with his practice, and the responsibility that he took on in the leadership of that, and how much he really knew and understood. So then it started off a different sort of appreciation of who he was, and I don't know, we just had many times of swapping stories, heartfelt stories. So that will always stand out for me because it was such a significant moment in the first place, but for me to finally get an understanding of what that was about was very important for me in my journey. And it was just his secondhand, his easy access knowledge.
Where he lived.
Yes, it was.
In large part.
Yes, it seemed it was.
How about for you, John?
I have so many stories in relationship to Charles, who I refer to him more than Raji. I think one of the things that struck me most about Charles from the time that I first met him was that he had a spiritual teacher and his love for his spiritual teacher. And one of the things that I couldn't see forthcoming was that his spiritual teacher would transition during the time that I knew him, and that transition would change Charles' life and change our relationship, because Charles would move from spending his time devoted to his teacher and his spiritual practice to pretty much working totally in relationship to his spiritual practice. So I experienced that change is a wonderful thing for Charles, and a big loss in some way to myself and some work that we were doing. But probably what was most special to me about my relationship with Charles was that he was my closest male colleague for a very long period of time. And we worked together on a project with Bell Atlantic, which was called the Black Managers Workshop. I was a consultant to that project, and Charles was one of the staff members. But that particular project is one of the most significant training interventions that's ever been made in a large top 5, top 10 corporation in America. Did extraordinary things in relationship to that company and what eventually became Verizon. Mm-hmm. And another project that we worked on was Charles was my co-leader, partner, and a bunch of work that we did for Royal Bank of Canada. But those are, again, kind of work things, and they were more background than foreground. I'll tell you the two things that were foreground for me. One, which seems insignificant even now at the time, but it was kind of a magical moment. We had arrived at the airport in Toronto. We were going someplace, I don't remember where it was, and I slammed my finger in a limo door. And I mean, really slammed it, jammed it. I mean, I was in incredible pain. And Charles came over to me and he said, "Oh, give me your hand." And I gave him my hand, and he held my hand for about 3 minutes, and the pain just disappeared and went away. And I thought, this man knows something that I don't know anything about. And that was pretty magical, and a pretty magical moment. It gave me some appreciation for what he could do in his own centeredness and groundedness and connected to the highest from his perspective, and his knowledge of just working with energy forces, which I had seen in other ways, but never in that particular way. But the biggest contribution that Charles made to the Gestalt OSD Center, which I've devoted much of my life to, is that he was a incredible theoretician, and he was a artist. And part of the thing that he did as a artist was he did graphic work. And so he actually took many of our conceptual models and produced graphics of them that we use to this day. And those graphics are very powerful because they help people make better meaning of linear two-dimensional models. He brings them into the three-dimensional or five-dimensional perspective and makes them much more powerful than they would be otherwise. And so I really appreciate that particular contribution that he made to the Gestalt OSD body of knowledge. And he lives in my heart in some very powerful ways because of that contribution that he made.
Mm. There's so much in there that I want to follow up with you, and we've already agreed that this will be just probably a part 1 in a series. First of all, I'd love for you to share what you're still using today because of those models. So, for example, the cycle of change, I don't know which one you're using, but I know that he continued to develop that, and he continued to take various principles, including Carter's Cube, which is your brain child, or came from your, from your own genius.
Yeah, well, actually ours.
And yours, both of yours. Thank you for that correction. You said something today that I thought it was your polite way of saying, yeah, I've been thinking maybe you might be a little bit crazy going on this little zigzag for zero, or putting yourself out there in healthcare as you are. As you know, Charles's transcendence from this world was through this sort of strange series of events, which I thought was an anomaly at first and later learned is very common, and that is that mistakes often happen in not just hospitalization, but in healthcare in general. And that many of those mistakes are preventable. We know what to do, we just don't do it. And I watched very early on, as I started to get familiar with this, I watched a profession that's human factors get very involved in healthcare and make some very significant changes. And it occurred to me, OSD has that capacity. And so over the years, I've sort of been sprinkling these notions throughout the new colleagues that I've made over the last 7 or so years. I would love for each of you to speak together. You can do it in conversation or what works best for you. But where do you think the intersection of organizational systems and development and your center might be particularly supportive in helping transform and maybe even transmute some of the challenges that we see in healthcare right now, which we spoke a lot about today? What are some of those, a couple of things, if you were to give physicians or nurses or administrators just a couple of pieces from your world as OSD professionals, what might that be? What do you think would be very helpful?
Okay. Well, I want to start by saying that Gestalt OSD is a combination of systems thinking, organizational development, theory and concepts, and Gestalt theory, concept, and method. And what we did almost 40 plus years ago was to take those three things and integrate them into one body of knowledge. We've now expanded that body of knowledge into something that we call Heartfulness organization and systems development. But the primary thing in terms of bringing those three original bodies of knowledge together was supporting people to do what we sometimes refer to as being able to walk into a room with anywhere from 1 to 1,000 people and make a difference with your presence. And basically what that means is that just by your presence, whether you say something verbally or don't say something verbally, but just by the essence of who you are and what you emit in terms of frequency and vibration, you evoke or provoke things in people that support them centering themselves, grounding themselves, and making, my language for it is, their desires or their dreams a reality, because they make contact with themselves and they make contact with others. And the way that I'm using contact is when I make contact with myself, some shift or change occurs, and when I make contact with you or I make contact with some other, you change, I change, and there's the potential of us creating a we. Something new gets created. Now, the reason I start with that is because I think that I and the Gestalt OSD Center and the firm that I headed for many years, John Carter and Associates, we've been involved in some of the most creative, innovative change projects that have happened any place in the world. And they've done things like we supported an accounting and auditing firm in Canada moving from number 7 in its business and industry to number 1. We helped the dental school at Case Western Reserve end up being accredited when nobody thought that they could be reaccredited, thought that they were going to lose their accreditation. And I could go on and on with things like that, including the Black Managers Workshop and the work that we did with that particular workshop. But the thing that I want to come back to is this thing about contact, because if people are centered, grounded, and the language that we use is connected to the highest, in other words, they're connected to whatever language that they use for the original source that exists within each one of us, it means that I have access to the indwelling intelligence or kind of universal wisdom that exists in each one of us. It puts us in touch with our individual uniqueness, our individual ordinariness, our individual humanness, and it's a combination of those three things that makes every single person extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about the medical profession and the work that I've done in it, both as a consultant, but also um, the work that I've ended up doing in it because I was a patient, I had 2 near-death experiences. The most powerful changes that I have seen come about when people who are physicians or healthcare providers, whether they're nurses or even your technician to some extent, happen when people are able to come from that place of being centered, grounded, and connected. And so people say, well, what does that look like? We had been doing some work with one of the top consulting firms in the world, and their consultants that primarily work with them in relationship to their working with leaders around the world. And we sat down at some point and said, they want us to do some more work with them. What has allowed us to be successful, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in accounting and auditing, whether it's in manufacturing, whether it's in the companies like Verizon that have to do with media and communication. And interestingly enough, the word that we came up with was love.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, wow, that's interesting. What does that mean? And we came up with a belief statement and a skill statement in relationship to love. And the belief statement is that love is the most powerful force. And what's the belief statement that goes with that statement? And that's that love is the ability to, from a skill standpoint, to fully accept what is, past, present, and future. And one of the things that's powerful in relationship to our change theory is that change comes about in a natural way when an individual, a group, or an organization basically surfaces an alienated aspect of itself, something that they are unaware of. They bring that alienated aspect, that part that they're unaware of, or my blind side to some extent, or our blind side. You bring it into awareness and you give it its rightful place. And in doing that, immediately the boundaries change, and so some change takes place. Some change takes place in me, and if that's interpersonal, some change takes place in you, and some change takes place in relationship to us. And so the places that I've seen that happen most powerfully in the systems that we work with, whether they're medical or not, is when, in fact, we are able to help people bring into their awareness something that they are unaware of, and in acknowledging that, give that alienated piece its rightful place, which basically changes everything. I think an example that I used with you this morning was a thing of, if you look at physicians and medical institutions or organizations, they often don't get sued because they left a sponge in somebody. They get sued because they left a sponge in somebody and then they refuse to actually have an interaction with that person about the error that was made. And typically, if they actually have that interaction, yes, I made a mistake, we made a mistake, and what do we need to do to correct it, and what do you need to do in terms of working with us to help us correct it? You don't end up with a lawsuit. You may end up with lots of problems that need to be resolved, but you don't end up with a lawsuit. You end up with a lawsuit when people actually don't engage each other in a way that contact is made. And so I get seen as human, you get seen as human. We also get seen as unique.
Yep.
You can't treat me like you treat any other patient. You have to treat me as this patient who's in front of you at this moment in time.
A human being, from a human being to a human being. There's quite a lot of evidence, science, and financial documentation that when that approach is taken in healthcare after harm, after even an error that maybe doesn't even result in quote unquote harm, that approach pays off. In other words, it helps the learning quicken, it helps the financial repercussions decrease. There's a lot of data to support that approach happens. What I find, though, and Veronica, I'd love to hear you just speak to your experience of this personally, is people, it's very easy to say, just love yourself and love each other. It is much, much more difficult to learn how to do that. And if there was one gift that I would say both the whole view of Gestalt and the whole view of yoga, which are sort of those two that I'm steeped in because of Charles, it is that it has given me practice ground. It has given me an environment of positive intent where I can fail and learn from that failing. I tell a lot of my medical colleague professionals, we need to learn how to fail better. We need to learn how to fail more successfully, not just in medicine, but everywhere. Veronica, would you just speak a little bit to, having heard John just sort of give the concepts? What's your direct experience of this, either, as a professional or as a patient, or maybe the combination of both?
Well, when you say this, I'm assuming you mean the medical field, the medical system. Yes.
Yes.
And so, because the other this is the Gestalt, the whole approach to whatever you're taking on from that perspective.
And I think either would be very
Yeah.
interesting to
Okay.
those who are listening.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is so profound about the Gestalt OSD, and now for us, the Heartfulness OSD, is really about thinking straight about change, how natural change occurs, how orchestrated change occurs, because the whole theory and methodology is grounded in observation about how change occurs naturally, both for individuals and for groups and for organizations. And this, that if you can think straight about how change occurs, and you can think straight about what is that issue and what the work is and how the work will get done, you can pretty much stay at the boundary of interaction until differences. I mean, we say change and contact happens at the boundary of difference. So to stay at that boundary of difference until something is transmuted, something is transcended, and some new ground is developed. And with respect to, you talked about mistakes, or John talked about mistakes and failures. One of the things that I love about the approach, this integration of the spiritual perspective or the yogic perspective and the perspective of applied behavioral sciences, is that each of them is dedicated to moving into and being willing to embrace and seize the value and the richness of embracing the shadow aspect of something, embracing the failure, taking interest in the failure, taking interest in the resistance to owning up to a mistake, or the resistance to talking about a mistake. And because one of the things that we say is there's no learning without anxiety, emotion, and failure. So if you're not failing on a regular basis, your really opportunity for learning is minimized. And the other thing about that I think is so profound about using the perspective, the OSD perspective, and is it really supports you developing the most accurate and rich what is picture, the picture of what the current circumstances are, and then really supports you attending to what are the uppermost things that need to be changed, and then to prioritize those things. And to just stay very curious when you see something looks very different from you. And you talked about giving an example, and one of the examples that we talked about that I wanted to share, that I talked about earlier today, was when I was told I couldn't ever get off my Synthroid. And I was on it for, gosh, about 15 years, was it, John? Something like that. And we have a somewhat like an adopted daughter. She's came into our lives, and she just never left. She came in to nanny our daughter, and so she became a naturopathic physician. And she called me one day and said, I want to get you off that Synthroid. I just took the 7th person off of Synthroid successfully, and she had been on it for 25 years. As long as you have a thyroid, trust me, I can help you make it work. So anyway, it was at John's insistence that, because we were so close, that she also involved her mentor in this process. So in fact, I met with him, and she prescribed some naturopathic approaches, one of which was a tincture that replicated the thyroid hormone. And so the first approach, when I met with her mentor, wasn't that he was going to treat my thyroid. His first approach was, today I'm going to treat you for abandonment, after he had talked with me for about 15 or 20 minutes, and I just didn't get it then, but I really get it now. Mm-hmm. And so within 6 months, I was off of the Synthroid, and I've been off it since then, which is about 20 years.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, and then I'll just, we're going to put a pause on this first series, and then we're going to move on to another series another day, but please say what's present for you both.
I just wanted to make one more comment about this thing of failure, because we often speak of failure with a negative valence on it. And as Veronica said, if you aren't having 3 or more failures a day, then you probably aren't living life very much to the fullest, because failure means nothing more than the fact that I expected something to happen and something different happened than what I expected. Mm. And it's in that gap between what I expected to happen and what actually happened that there's a potential for learning. Mm. So how did I scan my internal and external environment? How was I making meaning before I had this failure experience, something happening that was different than I expected? Because that's where I can actually learn something that will allow me to do a better job of assessment the next time I'm in a similar situation. Otherwise, I just repeat over and over what I did the last time that I was in that same situation. And I want to say one more thing in relationship to those 4 words that we came up with, because I mentioned love and thought, but the 4 words were love, thought, gratitude, and harmony. Mm. And thought, from our perspective, has to do with the thought is the most powerful action. And I'm going to hopefully tell this story quickly, but I used to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and because it was a creative time for me, and I would go and spend anywhere from an hour to 2 hours up in my office doing work, but it was really a very special creative time, and I always knew if I'm up at 2 o'clock in the morning, boy, good things are about to happen. So I wake up this morning, it's 2 o'clock, I go up, and I have some wonderful experience of writing and doing things, and I go, wow, and I'm done. I can go back to bed. So my office is on the 3rd floor. I walk to the top of these steps of the 3rd floor, and I go, I can go back to sleep. And just like that, I went to sleep. And I ended up at the bottom of the steps.
Not a good time to go to sleep.
Not a good time to go to sleep. And anyway, I find myself coming into consciousness, and I look down at my foot, and I don't realize that it's my foot, because I don't realize that I've fallen down the steps. And I go, wow, wonder whose foot that is. And I take this person's foot, not realizing it's mine, and I can turn this foot on the bottom of my leg totally around. It's basically not connected to my leg. And I go, I don't know whose foot this is, but their foot is in really bad shape. And then slowly my consciousness comes to a bit more awareness, and I realize I'm at the bottom of the steps of my house.
And that's my foot.
And that is my foot.
Oh, whoa.
And so I yell for Veronica, and Veronica comes. Make this long story short, I say to her, you got to get me to the hospital, but the first thing you need to do is you need to get me some arnica.
Mm-hmm.
And so she gets me some arnica, and she calls the 911. The ambulance comes and they take me. And I'm in so much pain that just they're going over a crack on the street basically hurts my foot and my leg and my body and my being. But we get to the hospital and I say, oh, we need to adjust this leg, but we can't operate and there's nothing that we can do with it because we have to wait until it swells and the swelling goes down. I said, it's not going to swell.
I put arnica on it.
I took arnica. I didn't even put it on it. I said, I took it. They said, it doesn't matter. I said, we need to give you a morphine shot that'll help you with the pain, but we can't do it. I said, it's not going to swell. I said, it's not even going to turn black and blue. They said, it's going to turn black and blue. It's going to swell. It didn't swell. It didn't turn black and blue. They waited for 3 days. And then they fixed my leg. Now, they would have had to fix my leg. I mean, it was seriously broken. My ankle was busted. My leg was busted. It took 9 screws and a rod and all that stuff to get it back into shape. But the fact is, they basically ignored information that I had about my body from years of experience of realizing I can do some pretty terrible things to my body, going back to Charles just doing something with energy, with his, however he did it.
Yeah.
And this stuff works. And I've always had the question, every hospital ought to have arnica in the emergency room.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't.
They don't. Charles got special permission from the anesthesiologist before his craniotomy, his brain surgery, to take arnica.
Mm-hmm.
And he was really grateful that somebody did listen to him, knew that he knew his body, and who knows, maybe they thought, well, it's a sugar pill, so it's not going to make any difference. But for Charles, he knew because he had similar experiences. We talked a lot earlier about the limitations of knowledge that certain systems have, and Western medicine being one of them. Maybe we'll pick up on that next time. I just want to circle back to something you said that I think would be particularly helpful for those who are listening, and that is that LOVE word. And I love your definition of it. I'm going to say it back to you just so that to see if I've remembered it, and also to make sure that it stands out for those who are listening, that when I'm in a place of being able to really be present and engaged with what was, what is, and what may be, that I am in a state of love. Did I get that somewhat right? And that
an acceptance of that.
An acceptance of that.
Acceptance
I'm not just present with it, but
without illusion. This is the reality.
This is it. This is what is. The part 2, and I'm going to say this now so that I'll remember when we get back, because it'll probably be on Zoom and it may not be for a while. It's that sense of what I perceive with a lot of people in healthcare is that they perceive that failure as something that they cannot acknowledge. They cannot accept it. It is somehow wrong. 2 or 3 a day would be devastating. And so even though they may know those mistakes and failures happen, they get buried. And so therefore the learning gets buried. And that way and then we see what we're seeing today, which is, in 20 years ago, the Institute of Medicine put out a report saying, we have way too much error and harm happening. We need to address that. And we're seeing just about the same today as we did then, if not more. And COVID's only illuminating it and exacerbating it. I can't change what is
if I don't acknowledge that it exists.
Exactly.
And the environment. I mean, one of the things we also say is context drives ground and ground drives figure. And the context does not allow for medical people to make mistakes. It's the pedestal got so high that it is, and there was a lot of advantage on both sides for that. People didn't have to take responsibility for their health care, and physicians got, the benefit and the burden of being on a pedestal like that. So that context has to be addressed, as well as the ground that it sets up, and then what happens to those errors that do get made, or mistakes, or as we talked about, a failure can be something very small or it can be something devastating.
Yeah. And how do we help individuals who create systems? Because I hear people talk about how do we fix the system? Well, you don't fix systems, in my view. You fix yourself. A person fixes oneself, and then they can help establish systems and processes and protocols that are actually coming from that acceptance place, from that love place. Thank you both for taking time again, and look forward to our next part whenever we can make that happen. And I truly love you. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.